effectively they've done is drive the Russian Black Sea fleet from its ports. Its significance both as a logistic line of communication, but also, if you like, its symbolic significance. And it's effectively a drone death zone. Putin is regarded as a perfect legitimate target, and he's running scared. He's moving from bunker to bunker rather than from palace to palace. And I think that's all down to Ukrainian intelligence and the Ukrainian ability to conduct long-range strikes. The Crimea is two things. It's a slightly mixed place. In terms of the ethnic population of Crimea, they're very largely Russian. They were very happily members of the Ukraine, but Russia always had this idea that's where they were going to control. And by treaty arrangements, their Black Sea Fleet was still based in Sevastopol. So that was all part of what they were doing. But in 2014, as part of the first wave of aggression from Putin, along with achieving a foothold in the Donbass to the east of Ukraine, the Russians seized Crimea proper, and then claimed that the Russian peoples of Crimea wanted to merge with Great Mother Russia. So they've always had that, and there's been huge sensitivity. It's been the great challenge, the strategic challenge of Russia over centuries, is how do you break out from their kind of continental heartland? And their options are quite limited. I mean, the Black Sea is one, and it's the only southern route out that gets blocked. And other than that, they've got either the Baltic, which is frozen for 6 months of the year, and the Arctic Ocean, which also is frozen. So the Black Sea has huge kind of significance to them in terms of what they're going to do. So they wanted to control and maintain that, which is why the bases were placed where they were, and why they seized the Crimea. I mean, since then, and particularly since the most recent war started in February 22, they've used it as a significant logistics base. And so a lot of the assaults onto southern Ukraine, Kherson provinces and places like that were directed and logistically supplied from out of the Crimea. So that's why the Crimea continues to have this significant importance. And we've seen, when one of the things you referred to earlier on was these railway strikes on the railways. It's a major logistics hub for the Russians in the southern part of the front. But the significance goes on even further. And you may recall that the Russians built a bridge, the so-called Kerch bridge, which is right at the far eastern side of Crimea, and effectively saves that very long journey right way round, then down into the Crimea, because Crimea is a peninsula from there. Called the Unity and Friendship Bridge. When it opened, President Putin got in the truck himself and drove across the bridge, one of his kind of manly enterprise things that show how tough he is. So he drove a truck across the bridge, and that bridge had been attacked several times by the Ukrainians. So its significance both as a logistic line of communication, but also, if you like, its symbolic significance, because the Russians see it as linking what they call Novorossiya, which is New Russia, which is the bits they've captured from there. It links New Russia to the Crimea, and so obviously as an iconic target, it's also been hit several times by the Ukrainians. So I mean, over a period of 2-3 years now, the Ukrainians have been able to push most of the Black Sea fleet out of the way. Right at the beginning of the war, there was significant threat to Ukraine, and particularly to Ukraine's grain exports out of Odessa. And that started a sort of whole series of conversations. One of their intentions, effectively, was to try and limit the Ukrainian use of the sea. Now, by a mixture of two things: first, some negotiations through third parties, particularly the Turks, but also more recently through significant actions against the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The majority of the Black Sea Fleet has now had to move from their main base, which was in Sevastopol, which of course is the major port in Crimea, much further to the east, out of range of where the Ukrainians were able to get to. Their range is improving. And what effectively the Ukrainians now have done is effectively drive the Russian Black Sea Fleet from its ports and made it ineffective. I think the idea of the Russian Black Sea Fleet being used for some amphibious operations, which I think was one of their original intentions, maybe even to strike Odessa, which is to the far west of Ukraine and obviously the Black Sea coast, I think that's gone. But they were trying to use the fleet for reinforcements and for raids on Ukraine proper. But now I think very much they're on the back foot. And every time you took these $1 million ships and they get hit by drones or by missiles, that's them out of action. And so the sort of the trade-off, if you like, and there's a sort of bizarre economy and trade in war, but the trade-off between a drone missile, a drone or a missile versus a multi-million dollar landing ship, is very much in favor of the missile. And so what they've been trying to do is move their stuff to the east, and that's where they're being kept. I mean, they're being penned in there. There are regular attacks on the bases they've got there, and causing significant amount of damage. But that's what's going on. They're using a lot of their own systems to do that. Though they do use systems that we provided, like Storm Shadow, but we've never been providing enough of them. It's not out of badness, but it's simply the manufacture of these things takes a long time. But they've needed a means of actually attacking long range targets themselves. What they've been really after a long time is the German system, the Taurus, which is probably the most effective kind of cruise missile style system going. But they've also been using these long range missiles and this kind of hybrid drone cruise missiles, particularly the Flamingo, which has got a very long range, up to 1,500 kilometers. It may even be longer than that, but that is an advertised range. And they're going to use those not against immediate battlefield targets, but against, as you say, these high value assets, like Russia's own missile systems and their radars, their intelligence hubs, all the things that they actually need to conduct the strikes, long range strikes against Ukrainian targets. Then the Ukrainians themselves are going to regard them as legitimate targets and try and write down that ability. So it's part of that kind of that campaign. It's a long exchange of long-range missiles against high-value targets. And if they can identify it, scan the missiles with their range or their radar sites to control them, they're absolutely going to go after them, and they're worth expending some of their more sophisticated equipment and missile systems to try and destroy them. The other thing that the Ukrainians have been very successful about is what you might call economic warfare, and they've been targeting Russia's primary economy, which is kind of oil and gas based economy. That's how they get the money in order to get the money out into the rest of the world. And they've been attacking targets as far north as Leningrad, and as far east as they can get. So you think how far Leningrad is from Kyiv. They've been hitting. They were sorry, St. Petersburg, but they call it Leningrad Oblast even now. But they're hitting those kind of targets from there. And it's a means of writing down Russia's ability to get oil out. Now, overall, is it making a significant difference? Yes, it is. But the because of what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, it's slightly offset by the fact that Russian oil is now able to flow again. So yes, it's a hit against Russia. But is it making a sort of overarching effect at the moment? I think probably less than it would have done before. If the crisis in the Middle East suddenly ceased, then the price of oil drops very much down again, then I think the effect of these attacks will be much greater, because again they'll limit Russia's ability to get oil out. But the bigger effect then on Russia and its oil production will be simply that this kind of current boost they've got to their wartime economy as a result of what's going on in the Middle East will be affected. So good targets, and they've been very effective. They're very precise about what they hit. I mean, oil refineries are huge. So there's no point just launching a missile. They're not easy to miss either. But the point is to hit the right bit of it, and they're getting very, very good at that. And that leads on to the question about intelligence. One thing that has also become very clear about what the Ukrainians have done is they have got good intelligence. They've got good understanding of the Russians. You'd sort of expect that all the years they spent sort of effectively together, that they understand the kind of psyche of the Russians. But they've also got very precise intelligence as to where these targets are, and that's very effective. Well, absolutely. I mean, there's one thing that the Ukrainians will be able to do, is develop this extraordinary capability to the extent that, and bear in mind that coming up in 2 days' time is probably the most iconic date in the Russian calendar, or the old Soviet calendar, which is May the 9th, which is their Victory Day parade. The story that's running at the moment is that there'll be no heavy weapons on that parade, precisely because the Ukrainians will regard this parade, which happens right in the center of Russia, right on Kremlin's Red Square, that they will not put armor there. Otherwise, the Ukrainians regard it as a target. So it gives you some idea of what's going on. We've also seen it, and the stories that starting to come out, that Putin is spending less and less time in what you might call his ordinary palaces. He has a number of palaces around the country, but he's spending less and less time in those kind of ordinary locations and more time in bunkers. I mean, what they have worked out is that if what the Israelis and the Americans did to the Iranian leadership right at the beginning of their campaign, they could also do to Putin. And Putin is a legitimate target. I mean, the number of assassination attempts which he threw at President Zelensky, particularly in the early stage of the war, there was no sense there of leaving the leadership alone so they could have negotiations. They attempted several times to assassinate President Zelensky, and so I think for that reason alone, Putin is regarded as the perfect legitimate target, and he's running scared. And the stories that are running at the moment, he spends a lot of his time in bunkers. He's moving from bunker to bunker rather than from palace to palace, and I think that's all down to Ukrainian intelligence and the Ukrainian ability to conduct long-range strikes. I'm sure they could round up the odd dictator from Africa and Asia to come along, and on the back of a promise of 100 million rubles or something. But I think that the days of it being a kind of massive kind of a sort of how gloriously well the Russians are doing, I think are slightly over for a bit. So it'd be interesting to see who does turn up, particularly as you rightly point out, if there's a possibility of a Ukrainian flamingo flying in over Red Square at the wrong moment. So I think they'll think it'd be should we say a more scaled down parade than before. I mean, one of the things that the Ukrainians will be able to do strategically, look across the whole front, is establish this very effective sort of defensive line across the whole of the area. They've now got us a defensive built, which is mostly down to drones, which is and bear in mind the front itself is some 800 miles long, 1,500 kilometers, 800 miles long, and the depth of the defensive belt is now about 19 miles or up to 30 kilometers in some places, and it's effectively is a drone death zone. Basically anything that moves in that is going to get hit by drones, but that works both ways. And so whilst and undoubtedly at the moment, the Ukrainians have got the advantage on over the Russians to the point where the Russians are moving backwards, and they certainly aren't even able to replace the forces they are losing. The question then arises: could Ukraine turn the tables? In other words, could you go from being an extraordinarily effective strategic defense into some kind of operational strategic offense, of which, and this is the question, answers your question, of which the Crimea might be the target? I think that's probably at the moment still a bit of a stretch. I mean, I'm not entirely sure the technology is there, or their ability to keep that going is there, or indeed the manpower, because Ukraine, while it's being extraordinarily effective in defence, has its own manpower problems in terms of numbers of soldiers that suffer from high rates of desertion, and everything that goes with that. So, yeah, the impact on Russia is huge, but so it is also on Ukraine, and they're losing people as well. So I think that in a short answer to your question, we don't know. It would be a very symbolic and very, very key target. It would make a huge operational difference to the war if Crimea did become the target. And as it goes right the way back to 2014, symbolically, and in terms of the message it sent about the effects of Ukraine, it would also be massive. But there is that operational problem, which is that what the Ukrainians have been able to do to the Russians could probably be able to do to the Ukrainians. I'm not entirely sure yet. Maybe I'm entirely wrong. I'm not sure yet Ukraine has the means or the power, capability, if you like, to conduct that kind of offensive against a target as huge as the Crimea. I mean, I think it'd be important. I mean, it's been damaged to the point where at some point it's been down to kind of one lane. I mean, so these had quite a lot of different damage to it, but it's a pretty massive structure, and I'm not sure yet they've been able to get the weapon systems on place to actually destroy it. They've hit the pillars, they've hit the roadway, they've hit pretty well everything in. I think every time they hit it and they close it, that sends a very strong message, that the Kerch bridge is closed, and that kind of sends a kind of sort of psychological shiver up the back of the spines of the Russians, and they know there is a problem. If the Ukrainians were able to drop it completely and put it into the water, that would be a very marked thing. So my expectation is that they'll continue to target it. I mean, they'd love to be able to drop it completely, but that might be more than they can do at the moment with their current missile and weapon systems. But wouldn't have a absolutely disastrous effect on logistics. I mean, a lot of the logistics will be further forward. They'll be able to reinforce it in different ways, but it would make logistics significantly harder if the Kerch bridge was down. But its real impact as a sort of target is strategic in terms and communication. So what's it say about the power of Ukraine versus the power of Russia? So it tells you a story, and I think the story is probably more significant than necessarily the sort of direct tactical or operational impact of losing that particular logistics supply. So I think where we are at the moment is not quite a stalemate, but we're kind of overall look at the whole front. I mean, at the moment, there's on the battlefield, Ukraine has the advantage, but it's a sort of an attritional advantage. I mean, the rate of casualties they're able to impose on the Russian, I mean, and the figures are horrific. I mean, 1.5 million Russian casualties since this war started. At the moment, the rate of attrition, which they'll be able to, and they're putting in very mathematical terms. They talk about being able to impose 50,000 Russian casualties a month. 50,000, I mean, that's almost larger than the entire British army, but they're 50,000 casualties a month on the Russians. And they know that their replacement rate, the Russians' ability to replace that, is around the 35 to 40. In other words, they're imposing more casualties than the Russians can replace. But it's an attritional warfare, and it's slow and it's bloody. And the Russians are very cautious. I mean, and rightly so. I mean, if I was their commander, I'd be thinking very, very hard. It was all sorts of extraordinary attempts by the Russians to try and to avoid being seen. If if you can't be seen, you can't be hit. But they move in small groups. They've appeared on bicycles. They even appeared on horses. Trying to evade the all-seeing eye of the Ukrainians. But I mean, that means it's very hard for the Russians to be able to develop the kind of the momentum and the kind of force at a particular point to achieve an effect. So we're in a sort of state of stalemate at the moment on the kind of battlefront across the area. The Ukrainians are able to make limited gains in specific areas when they want to try and do so, and they are doing that. And then we have this sort of war of missiles and everything that goes with that. The challenge is, how long can each side keep going? And the honest reality is they can both keep going for a while. I mean, the Europeans have now effectively replaced the Americans as the main suppliers. I mean, a lot of the kit that's coming in is still American kit, but it's now being paid for by the Europeans. So Ukraine has got now secure lines of logistics support from there, and Russia, on the other side, a couple of years ago, effectively turned itself into a war economy. So we're still fiddling around in the figures about whether we'll spend sort of 2.3, 2.4, 2.5% of our GDP on defence. They're spending 8% of their GDP on defence at the moment, and more if you take wider security into place. 40% all Russian government expenditure is defence and military related, and that's paid for by oil and gas that they're still able to get out through allies such as the Chinese. So both countries, in a curious way, are able to keep this war going for really a very long time, and that's hard for people to see how there's going to be a breakthrough. So we've effectively got a sort of I call it a strategic stalemate. Stalemate's probably almost too strong a word, but I can't quite find the word which says it's fairly static and it's based on attrition, and it's not going very fast, very far. And I think that's kind of where we are. So it's really all over to the politics, and also and what could change it? Oil price will change it. It's big things like that will change it. If the Middle East war is resolved quickly, Straits of Hormuz are opened, the oil price will collapse, and that'll have a direct effect then on Putin's economy. Because at some point, this complete distortion of the economy that he's put towards is going to come back and bite them. We've already seen that they're reducing the amount of money they're spending on various other items, and it's like maintenance of a car. You can keep putting maintenance of a car off forever and ever and ever until one day it stops. And that's sort of where they've got to, and that's where they are with their economy. They keep putting off things that they need to spend money on in order to keep the war going, and there's nothing left in the tank. At some point, that's going to bite, but it is kind of slow burn. It's not big, bold operational strokes. I mean, there are options for Russia. I mean, another offense through Belarus, some kind of diversionary attack, which would be massive in terms of challenge into someone like Estonia or Latvia. In other words, completely swing the target away. But that, I think, is the kind of move after next. But where they are at the moment, it's quite tightly engaged, and something could change. But I'm not seeing it at the moment. I don't think the kind of one thing he could have done was use things like tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, he's threatened that from time to time, but I don't think that's going to happen at the moment, because the consequences of doing that, I think, would be so massive that it would not be in his favour. We often tend to focus on Russia in terms of where we are, and then Ukraine's kind of given a bit of a pass. We shouldn't underestimate some of the challenges that Ukraine itself has got. I don't think it's going to have an immediate effect on the war, because they seem to be doing it. But there's a certain sort of grim kind of just keep plodding on attitude going on in Ukraine at the moment, and there are signs of dismay, aspects of the way in which President Zelensky's gone about his business. The argument about, for example, not having elections, that it's too soon to have elections. I mean, the elections are now overdue because of the war, and there is an element of internal opposition to him. Whether it will make a big difference, I don't know. But if at any stage the support tap was turned off from Europe, as was threatened to happen with President Trump, then I think that might make a difference. And the kind of, I call them the kind of peace to any price party, might start to come to the fore. It's not prominent at the moment, and I think there's a lot of grumbling about President Zelensky and aspects of the government there. At the moment, people in Ukraine are so grimly determined to see this through, but it doesn't necessarily mean that post ceasefire it will necessarily be a kind of place full of joy and happiness. I think it'll be quite a disrupted and really quite challenging country to govern at that point, because all the sacrifice will have been there. And the real danger is that the Europeans particularly will kind of turn the tap off precisely at the moment when they need to kind of keep tap flowing, albeit flowing in different directions in terms of reconstruction and everything goes there. So I think it's a country to watch for the future.